then we have later outbreaks or waves and fluctuations. Again, the terminology is not very important, but these continue to decrease the population of the empire. So this is the maximalist approach. Now, moving on from here to the critical revision, in recent years, there have been several studies that critique this maximalist approach by using interdisciplinary tools and sources. And maybe the place where these studies begin their criticism is on the mortality. So think about the previous slide that we've seen. The mortality estimates there are really based on Black Death comparisons, so comparisons between the Black Death and the Justinianic Plague. They're both plague epidemics, so to speak, and 6th century texts. Now, these more critical studies ask different questions of that mortality estimate. Questions such as, is the comparison between the Justinianic Plague and Black Death even relevant? Are the accounts we use reliable? And maybe what about other sources, non-literary sources as well? You can see a few examples of these studies here at the top. You can see some of the media coverage that has covered these studies at the bottom. And maybe a good place to start would be to go over some of the issues with the existing evidence we have for plague. And we'll start by looking at two literary sources, the two most influential literary sources on plague. The first is Prokopios of Caesarea, 6th century historian, who wrote the most influential description of plague on scholarship. And he tells us that in Constantinople, at the height of the Justinianic Plague, 5,000 people die per day, then 10,000 people die per day. Plague lasts for 4 months. Provides more details as well. He tells us that Justinian was responsible for the deaths of 1 trillion people, question mark, I guess. And he tells us that half the population died. Now, the big question, of course, is whether we should take these reports of high mortality at face value. And I guess we can already start questioning the numbers that Prokopios provides us. For example, we can look at the first numbers, so the numbers about Constantinople. If we actually take those numbers and we multiply them by the time plague lasts, the result is larger than current estimates for the population of Constantinople more broadly. So I'm not sure if we should accept that. Then the deaths of 1 trillion people is obviously an exaggeration. Back then, if you remember a few slides back, the estimates we have of population in the Eastern Roman Empire at the time is only 30 million. Today, where we have somewhere around 8 billion people worldwide, so 1 trillion is clearly not realistic. And both that point, both the second and the third points here, both come from the Secret History of Prokopios. This is a text in which Prokopios critiques Emperor Justinian. It's really an invective. And in the particular chapter from which both these points are taken, so points 2 and 3 are taken, Prokopios starts that chapter by describing Justinian as a demon in human form, and then goes on to the trillion people, and then goes on and provides a long list of disasters, anything from wars and earthquakes and floods and so on. After that very long chapter, he finishes the chapter with a single sentence, which you can see right here, that the plague broke out as well and carried away half the survivors of all these previous disasters. So again, take all this at face value, answer, probably not. Prokopios is also one of the 11 known imitations of Thucydides' account of the plague of Athens. Thucydides writing 1,000 years earlier. But that account, so the Thucydides account, was seen by a lot of people in antiquity, a lot of authors in antiquity, as something that is worthy of imitation. Prokopios and 10 other people at least to do that. And those emulators, Thucydidean emulators, I guess, as Kennedy has pointed out, frequently transformed what are probably minor epidemics to large-scale plagues in the Thucydidean scale, just because of the way they tried to emulate Thucydides, and not because these epidemics were really big or significant. The longest and second most influential description we have for plague is a person called John of Ephesus, a bishop from the east. And he also provides us some numbers. He tells us that in Constantinople, the same outbreak, even more people died. So up to 16,000 people died every day, and over 300,000 people in total died only in Constantinople. He also tells us that only 1 of 1,000 people survived the plague. And again, we should ask, how reliable is this account? Now, if we read this account from beginning to end, he actually tells us that it tells us that John of Ephesus understands plague as really a realization of a biblical prophecy. He provides more warning signs that happened before plague, that he argues or claims happened before plague. And some of these, for example, he tells us about 5 major earthquakes that happened in Annapolis, where he claimed it was in the year before plague, so 540, 541 or so. But this, for better or for worse, this is a time in which we have pretty good coverage of what's going on in Constantinople. We have a lot of people writing at that time in Constantinople, and no one else, no other source refers to any of these earthquakes. So again, lots of questions about the reliability of, in this case, John's account. We can also try to think about why John is writing his account. One argument we could make is that he's actually trying to talk about greed. He's using plague to talk about greed and how greed is the real problem in the world. From his perspective, from John's perspective, plague is a divine chastisement that God has sent to get people to repent of their sins. This I will pass, and at this point I will pass things to Merle. Stop sharing.
Thanks, Lee. Am I good with the screen? Okay. Your audio is a little glitchy, Lee, just so you know, at least on my end. But just wanted to make you aware. Okay, so I want to pick up now where Lee left off, which is some of the more critical revision points that we're making, and to take that and move forward from there using some quantitative data that we've put together. So the first thing I should say is a lot of this evidence has never been put together before. And so we put together large data sets to understand if we could see any evidence of plague within these large data sets. So I'm going to walk us through 3 different types, and there's more evidence of each one of these. So if you're curious, feel free to follow up. But I'll just kind of describe how each one of them works. And then after that, I'm going to go into some new work we're doing before I hand it back to Lee, who will then hand it back to me at the very end, and I will conclude. So the first thing which you can see on your screen is what are called inscriptions, right? So many of you, if you're allowed out of your house anymore, I don't really walk out of my house as much anymore, you can probably see on big buildings, you'll see like a inscription attached to it, right? So-and-so paid for it in such and such a year with funding, blah, 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 blah. So we have these from antiquity. We also have essentially funerary inscriptions, which is to say, right, just like tombstones today, we have information on when people died, sometimes how they died, right, various things that are written on their inscriptions. And what people have proposed over the last 30 plus years or so are kind of 2 ways in which we could use this evidence of epigraphy, of inscriptions, to understand the plague. And they're actually kind of contradictory, and that's the first point you see on the screen. And I can't resolve the contradiction, I just want to point it out, which is that plague would cause more inscriptions, right? You'd have more tombstones because more people died. And then people have also argued at the same time that you would have fewer inscriptions because people are dying so quickly that you can't make tombstones for them all. And they're also dying so quickly that you're not building new buildings, right? So people have made both of these sets of arguments. So what Lee and I went out to do is we put together all of the dated inscriptions we could find from various databases that exist online across the entire Mediterranean world. And so here I've just given you one from Syria. We have other ones from Western Europe, from Italy, et cetera, really from all over the place. And what we wanted to do is say, well, do either one of these ideas work, right? Do either one of these propositions make any sense? And what we found essentially is there is nothing in the data. So what I'll point to here with the red, you'll see this in the next couple slides, is this dotted line is the outbreak of plague. And this will repeat itself in the next couple of slides. So just pay attention to the dotted line. And what you can see across from before and after is essentially no pattern whatsoever, right? Certainly not in the century or so from say about 500 to 600. Now, as probably many of you will notice, you'll see a drastic drop off here at the very end. This relates almost entirely to the Islamic conquest of the Middle East. And so you see that show up in the data very clearly. But in terms of plague, there is no evidence either way for either one of these ideas that have been proposed. The second data set we put together and it analyzed from both a qualitative and a quantitative analysis is papyri. Now, papyri, which we give you an example on the right-hand side of the screen, is made from a plant, but it's essentially like paper. It's what the people in the ancient world used to write on. It only survives from Egypt for the most part, with a couple exceptions here or there. This has to do with climate issues. But what you can do is there's hundreds of thousands of pieces of papyri that survive. So this is all, again, in an online freely accessible database. So what Lee and I did is we first went to the database and we basically tried to figure out, was there any evidence of plague whatsoever? And in no piece of papyrus have we ever found, this includes letters, this includes tax receipts, this includes all types of things. We couldn't find any evidence of anyone talking about an epidemic, or a plague during this time period. And the second thing we pointed out is, again, we put it on a graph here. You can see well, is there any change in evidence? Maybe more people are dying, so people are writing less, or maybe people are writing more, or something. Whatever you want to propose as a hypothesis, but essentially, as you can see, there's no pattern in the data whatsoever. So that was the second type. The third type we put together with our colleague Adam Izdebski, who works on pollen a lot, is pollen evidence, as you can see. Now, pollen evidence, I'll just walk you through what this looks like, what it's useful for, and then what it shows very quickly. But again, always happy to go into more details on any of these data. So pollen data, how you extract it is you go to a lake usually, you drill a hole, which is what these two fun little stick figures are doing. They're drilling a nice hole. This is a very nice diagram. When I showed this, there's a great video you can watch of people doing this up at UConn if you're really curious, that I always show. And what you pull out is one of these cores, or as I tell my students when I teach this, it looks kind of like a giant poop. And you pull these out. You cut them in half, and so they look like this, and they can be dated, right? The higher up you go, the more recent they are. And what the dating gives you and what the pollen gives you is all types of little pollen samples that are hanging out, right? And what you're looking for in this pollen sample is essentially